This is video 3 of 4 in Module 1, Introduction to Biochemistry. In this video review of aqueous chemistry, I'm going to talk a little bit about why water is an essential molecule for life. Okay, so water is essential to life. This sort of comes naturally to all of us, but why? Why is water so essential to life? And some of these may seem more intuitive than others, but some of them may surprise you. And so the first is organisms are mostly water. Human beings are 70% water. So we're essentially aqueous chemical systems. Water also influences the shape and function of many biomolecules, like especially for proteins and also lipids. Water influences the shape and function of these molecules through what's called the hydrophobic effect, which I'm going to talk more about at the end of this slideshow. Water is, because organisms are mostly water, water is therefore the medium in which most biochemical reactions occur. Many properties of water actually make it the perfect environment for biochemical reactions. Water is also needed for the transport of nutrients and waste. It's a really good solvent for dissolving polar and charged molecules and for transporting them throughout the body. And then lastly, water participates usually as a reactant in many biochemical reactions itself. It can accept electrons, it can donate electrons. Due to its polarity, it can do both of these properties, and it can also form hydrogen bonds, which are really critical, very important, non-covalent reversible bonds. And it's this reversible bonding that makes so many biochemical processes possible. Or one example of that, if that doesn't sort of come intuitively to you, one example of this is the hydrogen bonds that hold together the DNA double helix. DNA has to be replicated in order for cells to replicate. And in order to do that, we need to be able to break up a DNA double helix into two single strands. So it's a good thing that that double helix is held together by the simplest of bonds, a hydrogen bond. Those hydrogen bonds are easily broken so that DNA can be replicated, but they also easily reform in the aqueous environment of our bodies. And then the sum of all of those hydrogen bonds in the core of the molecule actually work fairly well to keep it together and keep it stable. But it's reversible binding. And so if the DNA double helix was held together by covalent bonds, it would take a tremendous amount of energy for a cell to replicate its genome and also replicate, which would sort of defeat the purpose. Okay, so let's look at some of the unique properties of water that make it so essential for life. Water is made up of a single oxygen molecule and two hydrogen molecules bonded to it. Oxygen forms covalent bonds with these two hydrogen atoms, and so that's a very strong interaction there. But water, the molecule, has two unshared pairs of electrons, and so therefore water takes on this tetrahedral shape where there's a bend and a partial charge on either end of the poles. The oxygen is more electronegative than the hydrogens, and so the oxygen tends to pull the shared electrons closer to itself, and they hang out less near the hydrogen poles. And because of that unequal electron sharing, this creates what's called a dipole or polarity, where oxygen has a partial negative charge because the negatively charged electrons tend to hang out on this side of the molecule more often, and the hydrogens have a partial positive charge as a result. Covalent and non-covalent bonds are both really important in liquid water. So again, for covalent bonding, these are stronger than non-covalent bonds. These are equal sharing of electrons between atoms. And so non-polar covalent bonding, which is not the case with water, this is the case with other molecules, such as nitrogen in its gaseous form, so N2. So non-polar covalent bonding is the nuclei contain the same charge, and the electrons that are shared between them, and because they are bonded together, these electrons are being shared in that bond. The electrons spend equal amounts of time near each of these central nuclei. In polar covalent bonding, which is the case with water, there is a larger positive charge on the oxygen nucleus and a smaller positive charge on the hydrogen nucleus. And as a consequence, the electrons tend to be drawn more often to the larger, more positive nucleus. And so the hydrogens therefore have a slightly positive charge, and the oxygen therefore has a slightly negative charge. For non-covalent bonding, there's no sharing of electrons. And so therefore the interaction between two molecules engaged in a non-covalent bond are weak, constantly breaking, reforming, breaking, reforming. They're easily broken. They're less favorable than covalent bonds, so less energy is needed to break them. Non-covalent bonds are critical in maintaining the three-dimensional structures of things like proteins or nucleic acids. And so I mentioned this in the last slide, where the hydrogen bonding in the core of a DNA double helix is what holds them together, but those are all non-covalent bonds. A protein in its three-dimensional form is held together by hydrogen bonds and ionic interactions between different amino acids. And so there's no electron sharing, and therefore these are weaker bonds. But what's unique about water is because water has both a partial positive and a partial negative charge, water molecules are really cohesive. They tend to stick around closer together. So I'm going to come back to this in a second, but this is one of the reasons why water is so important. I'm going to come back to that. And so again, water participates in 4 different hydrogen or in different bonds with itself. So it can hydrogen bond with itself. It can accept hydrogen bonds on the positively charged side, the negatively charged side, and it can donate to hydrogen bonds on the positively charged side. When water is in its solid form and forms ice, water molecules are not moving around as much, and therefore, so just the simple movement of water molecules in liquid is enough energy to break those hydrogen bonds, just that slight movement of molecules. But when we drop the temperature and water becomes a solid state, the molecules aren't moving around as much, and therefore the hydrogen bonds stay formed for longer periods of time. And when this happens, each water molecule can form 4 hydrogen bonds with other water molecules in a lattice. And as I mentioned, so that is dependent on an ice or a solid state. And so when the molecules are not in motion and slow down enough, those hydrogen bonds are allowed to exist for a lot longer, since these molecules aren't moving and therefore not absorbing energy that would easily break those hydrogen bonds. When water is in its liquid form, it forms on average about 3.5 hydrogen bonds with neighboring water molecules. But because they're in continuous motion, they're constantly breaking and reforming, breaking and reforming. So we don't say that it has 4 hydrogen bonds. It has slightly less than that, since the energy created by the movement of the molecules is enough to break up those hydrogen bonds really easily. Steam represents water that doesn't hydrogen bond at all. It's too far away, they're too dispersed, and so no hydrogen bonds are formed between water molecules when it's in its gaseous state. And so at room temperature, ice will melt spontaneously because the delta G is negative. And so I want you to think about, why would the delta G be negative? I'm going to come back to this point in the live session. So think about this question, this red question here. I'm going to open the live session with that. Okay, so what is so great about water? I've already kind of mentioned that that it is important, but why is it so important? And so these are the 3 properties of water that make it so critical and so essential to life. So I'm going to go through each of these points with different slides to follow. So first, the polarity of water allows the formation of hydrogen bonds between water molecules in liquid water, which accounts for the cohesiveness of water. I'm going to talk about that first. Second, the polarity of water also accounts for its ability to dissolve many important biochemicals. So it's really good solvent. And then lastly, the inability of water to dissolve nonpolar molecules results in an important organizing principle called the hydrophobic effect. And so water can interact with molecules favorably and dissolve them, but it can also interact with other molecules in a non-favorable way, which is actually important for driving things like protein folding in enzyme function. Okay, so let's first talk about this first point, The first point here, which is the polarity of water, allows the formation of hydrogen bonds and accounts for cohesiveness. One of the unique properties of water is that it can form hydrogen bonds with itself. Each water molecule electrically attracts its neighbors, and this makes water sort of a sticky medium. In liquid, these bonds are continuously forming and breaking and forming and breaking. And so there's a tug of war happening on all sides of a water molecule. So we see the tug here happening between this oxygen and this hydrogen, but this bond is really transient. And so it will break very easily in liquid water since these molecules move around quite a bit. And so we have a tug of war happening here. And then we could easily see a situation where these molecules shift their space, and you can see the tug of war happening here. You can see the tug of war happening between these two atoms. And so this creates surface tension, or the tendency of a liquid surface to resist rupture when placed under stress. And so this constantly bond breaking and forming is all happening sort of in the body of the liquid medium. At the surface, these forces all sort of pull down. So there's a tug of war pulling more down. So the molecules at the surface have fewer neighbors, right? Because there's air above these water. And so because those molecules have fewer neighbors, what neighbors are there will experience a stronger force since there's no movement of water above the surface of this water. And so this creates surface tension. Okay. I also mentioned that one of the cool and important properties of water is that it's a really good solvent. It's really good for dissolving important biochemical molecules. And so the partial negative and simultaneous partial positive dipole is what gives water this property. So it can dissolve ions of any charge. And so let's think about salt. And we all kind of know that salt dissolves in water. We've all done it probably in our kitchens before, and we're about to like cook some macaroni and cheese, toss a little salt in that water. And it dissolves fairly readily. And so salt is made up of NaCl, compounds of NaCl that form this lattice structure here that you see. So this is one compound of salt. Water has a partial positive and a partial negative charge. And so the partial negative charge on the oxygen in a water molecule will point itself towards this positively charged salt ion and create what's called a solvation shell, where the negatively charged side of water surrounds the positively charged molecules, and then the positively charged parts of water on the hydrogens will surround the negatively charged molecules. So it can dissolve it can dissolve positive molecules, it can dissolve negative molecules. So it's a really good solvent for that purpose, for that reason. And then lastly, the last thing, who cares about water? What's so great about water is the hydrophobic effect. The hydrophobic effect is this observed tendency of non-polar substances to aggregate in water in order to exclude all of the water molecules. So imagine, if you will, right now in your head, a drop of oil in a glass of water. That oil is not dissolved in that water. It sort of falls and sinks right to the bottom. It sticks together. The oil molecules are not broken up. They all stick together. Even if you were to take a spoon and go in there and try to chop up that oil molecule, those oil droplets will eventually all come back together again to form one giant oil droplet. That is the hydrophobic effect in action. What happens here is nonpolar molecules cannot form hydrogen bonds with water. There's no electrostatic interactions between a nonpolar molecule in water. So initially, nonpolar molecules will look like this in an aqueous environment, where water is going to try and surround it, but doesn't really surround it with any real order. Note how there's like the oxygen is pointing towards it here, the hydrogen is pointing towards it here. It can form hydrogen bonds. And so it's not really able to, it can't really dissolve in this. And so what's going to happen here is nonpolar molecules together in an aqueous environment are going to come together to form a much larger water droplet. Why is that? The presence of a nonpolar molecule in water displaces water molecules. So these water molecules are trying to to form some kind of interaction with these nonpolar molecules, but can't do it. And so displaced water molecules make hydrogen bonds more freely with each other, which increases the number of hydrogen bonds they're involved with. And again, if we increase the amount of hydrogen bonds a water molecule is involved with, that will increase entropy. Any water molecule that's surrounding a nonpolar molecule cannot participate in as many hydrogen bonds as it otherwise normally would. Let's look back at this slide, or actually here, this slide here. So we're participating in water and reactions here in ionic bonding. Water is also participating in hydrogen bonding with itself, but in the presence of a nonpolar molecule, neither of those things can happen. So what happens is nonpolar molecules will cluster together, which will decrease the amount of ordered water around this molecule. And so water molecule is considered ordered if it's not creating as many hydrogen bonds with its neighbors. The more hydrogen bonds it can create with its neighbors, the more disorder we have, or the more entropy we have. And so when nonpolar molecules aggregate together, this is actually a thermodynamically favorable interaction because entropy is increased. Why is entropy increased? Because there's less water trying to order itself around these two molecules, or around the single molecule, as is around this one. You can simply count them up, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What is that? 7 molecules around this one, 7 molecules around this one. So that's 14 total water molecules that are now not able to participate in hydrogen bonds with its other neighboring water molecules. What did I say, 14? And so here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 molecules here. And so now there's fewer ordered water molecules than there are here. There's 14 here and only 9 here. And so we've released these ones, these 5 water molecules. They are now able to form hydrogen bonds with its other water molecule neighbors. And so we've increased entropy in this system. This is a really important property for protein folding. The hydrophobic effect drives the nonpolar components of a protein to cluster away from water and bury itself in the center of the protein. And it also encourages any polar amino acids to interact favorably with water. And so if the nonpolar components cluster away from the water, this increases the amount of disordered water. And also, and so that amount of disorder experienced by the water offsets the order that's being experienced by the folded protein. Let me try and say that one more time. So here's an unfolded protein. Lots of water molecules are surrounding this thing to try to dissolve it. And lots of water, and so these are 4 different proteins. This protein itself is fairly disordered, right? It's not folded up, it's taking up more space, it's wiggling around. This protein is far more ordered. So how is that possible? How is it possible for an ordered protein, a disordered protein to move to an ordered folded protein? That's against the law of thermodynamics. We want to move from order to disorder. When a protein folds, it moves from disorder to order. So that shouldn't happen on its own. We can thank the hydrophobic effect for the fact that it does happen on its own, which is the amount of entropy that increases as a result of releasing all that water offsets the amount of entropy that is decreased by the folding of the protein. And so lots of disordered water and only a little bit of ordered protein gives you a net result of an overall increase in entropy. And so therefore it happens spontaneously. The cell membrane formation, or the ways our cells come together, is also powered by the hydrophobic effect. And so I'm going to come back to this in more detail in a later lecture. But our cell membranes are made up of phospholipids. Phospholipids have a hydrophilic head that interacts favorably with water. It's a polar end on this side, and hydrophobic tails that are nonpolar that tend to cluster together. And so if you were to toss a bunch of phospholipids individually in water, what would naturally happen is this formation, where you have the polar heads are interacting favorably with the aqueous environment on this side and also on this side. And the nonpolar tails are clustering together in the center. And so we have a nonpolar core for the lipid bilayer and polar outside. And so that means that any biochemical reactions that require an aqueous environment can happen inside the cell. And that inside of the cell can be separated by this nonpolar barrier from the outside of the cell. So as I mentioned, if you were to toss a bunch of phospholipids in water, they would naturally cluster together and form micelles or bilayers, as I was just showing you on the last slide. And the reason is because entropy increases as water is released from being so ordered. And so let's break this down. This is just another example of how we can create more disordered water molecules when nonpolar substances come together. So here I have the polar head, it's dissolved in water. And then we have these nonpolar tails, and water again is trying really hard to come up with some interaction for to surround this molecule, but can't form ionic interactions, can't form hydrogen bonds because this substance is nonpolar. And so these three phospholipids together will create or will kind of steal these water molecules away from its neighbors. And so these are not able to form hydrogen bonds anymore with its neighbors because they're ordered trying to surround these hydrophobic tails. But if these three tails come together and cluster together, then we release a lot of that water, right? So now we only have order around the outside of this one, around the tips here and the outside of this one. All of the water that was surrounding this one has now been released, and those molecules are allowed to create hydrogen bonds with other water molecules. That increases entropy. If this process continues and we cluster all of those nonpolar components away from water, that means we have completely sequestered all of those nonpolar tails away from water. And so now all of the water in the system is interacting favorably either with the polar heads or with each other in the form of hydrogen bonds. So this would represent the greatest increase in entropy in this system. This type of hydrogen bonding is not unique to water. Water can form hydrogen bonds with itself, but it can also form hydrogen bonds with nitrogen molecules and oxygen molecules. These are the most common types of hydrogen bonds. So this would be between water and nitrogen and water and oxygen. Note that hydrogen bonds do not form if a hydrogen is linked to a carbon molecule. So a CH bond cannot form hydrogen bonds. There's no unequal sharing of electrons that happens here. And so therefore, this hydrogen does not have a positive charge that would interact favorably with the negative oxygen on a water molecule. So this is why these tails are made up of CH bonds. They cannot hydrogen bond with water. So I mentioned before that these non-covalent interactions are critical for life. They are individually very, very weak. So here's bond strength, the relative strengths of different types of bonds. We have our covalent bond here, and it takes about 400 kilojoules per mole to break that bond. For an ionic interaction, which is the type of interaction between a sodium ion and water, so the positively charged sodium ion interacts with the negative partial charge of the oxygen in the water. So that takes about 100 kilojoules per mole to break. Hydrogen bonds are even weaker at about 20 kilojoules per mole to break. And van der Waals interactions represent the weakest non-covalent bond. But these weak interactions are really the key by which molecules interact with each other. So when an enzyme binds to its substrate, it's binding by ionic interactions and hydrogen bonding. Why? Because an enzyme has to be able to release that substrate as easily as it can bind that substrate in order for the process to be correct, to finish correctly. Same with hormones and their receptors. A hormone comes together with its receptor via ionic interactions and hydrogen bonding in an aqueous environment. Hormones binding to a receptor should not remain that way forever. When a hormone binds a receptor, there's a signal inside the cell and a reaction to some sort of outside stimulus. But when that outside stimulus stops, we want to be able to stop the cellular response. And so a hormone has to detach from its receptor as easily as it can bind to its receptor. And so the strength and specificity of these weak interactions depend on the medium in which they recur. And the majority of biological interactions occur in water. Why? Because the hydrogen bonds in water, because water can hydrogen bond and contribute to these interactions. And they also can contribute via the hydrophobic effect. And so it represents the perfect medium for these biological interactions to take place, these reversible biological reaction. So I just wanted to include this slide to show you the differences between, or just sort of sum up all of that that I just mentioned, the different types of bonds that water can form with biochemical molecules. And so hydrogen bonds will occur due to electrostatic attractions between a proton in one and the electronegative atom in the other. And so this would be hydrogen bonds occurring between water molecules and liquid water, or between a water molecule and the polar head of a phospholipid, or a polar hormone dissolved in the bloodstream. Ionic interactions also are reversible and can contribute to biochemical reactions. And so this would be the interaction between bicarbonate in the bloodstream and carbon dioxide in the bloodstream. So I'm going to talk more about the bicarbonate buffering system later. Hydrophobic interactions occur in water due to the inability of nonpolar molecules to hydrogen bond with water. And so even the inability to form a hydrogen bond is an essential process for biochemical reactions. This is video 3 of 4 in